What SAT score do you really need to get into an Ivy League university? And if a university is test optional, do you really need to submit your score at all? So during the pandemic, most universities went test optional because students didn't have equal access to testing centers. But starting in 2024, a number of top universities have reversed course, and they are now requiring either the SAT or the ACT starting in the fall of 2024. And some of these schools include Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, Caltech, UT Austin, and a number of other schools. And some of these schools are making special considerations in the near term. So for example, at Yale, for 2024, you can either submit your SAT or ACT, or you can submit all of your AP scores. And Cornell for 2024 is switching from test optional to test recommended. And then starting in 2025, it will be test required. So what about schools that remain test optional? Do you really need to submit your scores? Well, technically speaking, you don't need to. And if you look at who actually applies to these schools, about 50% of students submit their scores and 50% don't. But when you look at who actually gets admitted, it tells a very different story. So looking over the past few years at Princeton, for example, about 85% of admitted students submitted their score. And at Harvard, it was equally high. It was 83%. And as you go down the line at other competitive schools like UPenn, Columbia, Boston College, and virtually every other top 20 school, it tells the same story. While they technically allow you to apply without submitting your scores, they disproportionately favor students who submit their scores. So what SAT score do you actually need to get into an Ivy League university? Well, let's look at Harvard University for the class of 2027 because their numbers are very similar to all the other top 20 schools. The average freshman SAT score at Harvard was 1520. And that means that half the applicants who got in scored above that and half the applicants who got in scored below that. And we also know information about the percentiles. So the 25th percentile was a 1490, which means that 25% of admitted students scored below 1490. And the 75th percentile was 1580, which means that a quarter of the students who were admitted scored a 1580 or above. And when you look at this chart, you might actually think, oh, all I need is about a 1520 or even something a little lower like a 1480 to get into Harvard, because obviously there's students who got in. But this is really the wrong way of thinking about college admissions because it doesn't take into account the way students are actually admitted. At the top universities, students are admitted holistically, which means they're admitted based on how well they fill different buckets or how well they fill different university needs. So let's look at that Harvard SAT bell curve again. For the sake of argument, I'm going to simplify some of these numbers, but I think it'll make the overall impression much clearer. So for example, we can safely assume that roughly 20% of students admitted to Harvard are recruited athletes. And while some of those students may actually have astronomical SAT scores, we know that it's very difficult to overexcel in more than one area. So more than likely, the recruited athletes are either scoring around the average SAT score or below. We also know that another 20% of admitted students to Harvard are VIP candidates, or what we call friends of the university. This could be students whose parents donated a ton of money to college. This could be students who are children of faculty. At different universities, these can be legacy students, right? Particularly parents who are very involved in fundraising for the school or alumni outreach. It could also be students who are famous Hollywood actors who now want to go to Harvard. It could also be students who are the children of presidents, right? It's not to say that none of these students have top SAT scores, but on average, they probably have much closer to a 1520 or below because they over-index in other areas. Another 20% of spots in the freshman class go to DEI candidates. These universities are aggressively looking for students who are underrepresented on campus. So they're looking for African American students, Latino students, Native Americans, and any other ethnic groups that traditionally haven't been represented on campus. Again, some of these students will be phenomenal and they'll have really high SAT scores. But on average, they're recruiting these students not purely based on merit, but because they're going to bring the university other things. So you can expect many of these students will have average or even below average SAT scores. And then you've got another 20% who are disadvantaged students, students who come with hardship. These are low-income students. These are QuestBridge applicants. These are students who are considered first generation. Neither of their parents graduated from college. They also might be students who represent geographical diversity. Maybe they come from a rural farm community where very few candidates go to college, let alone to Harvard. So again, another 20% of candidates will be filling that bucket. That means that if you don't have any of those special considerations going for you, then you are competing for the remaining 20% of spots. That's it. You're not eligible for the other 80% of spots. You are competing for the last remaining 20% of spots. And worse than that, because of gender parity, you're either getting admitted as a male or a female. So it's really only the 10% of remaining spots that you're competing for. And now you can see that you cannot afford to have average scores. There can be nothing about your application which is average at all, because you're competing purely on merit against the best of the best. So you have to think you're competing against the best students in your state, the best students in your country, and the best international applicants as well. So you think to yourself, what kind of SAT scores are those students submitting? And these are the students who are traditionally in the 75th percentile. These students are getting 1580 and above, and that's who you're competing against. Now, if you're competing against a student and the student has a 1580 and you have a 1550 or maybe a 1530, are you going to lose out to that student necessarily because of your SAT score? No, because the difference is too small. But if you're competing against a student who has a 1580 and you only have a 1480, you can be fairly certain who they're going to admit. So my point in showing you all of this is to show that unless you're getting in because of some sort of special consideration and you fall into one of those specialty buckets, then you're going to be hoping to get in based purely on merit. And that means you're not competing against a full applicant pool. You're competing specifically against the very best candidates, and the very best candidates are scoring in that top quartile. So what can you do with this information? I recommend that students spend junior year making SAT prep or ACT prep a top priority. That means enrolling in a prep program or committing to a self-study program, but really dedicating several months to doing everything you can to improve your score. And when I work with students, I fully expect them to improve by about 200 points on the SAT and about 4 or 5 points on the ACT. And if you're looking for free resources, you can go on collegeboard.org, which has a number of full-length digital practice tests available to you. You can also use Khan Academy, which has a lot of free practice questions that you can use. And there are a number of books out there that have all kinds of practice questions from the past that are really good to give you practice, to make sure you're familiar with the types of questions that they ask, to get better at time management and everything like that. But make it a priority and then make sure you submit your scores. I hope this video was helpful. If you want to reach out to me directly, I'll put my email in the video description, and good luck.